Hello and welcome to A Critical Dragon, where I talk about narrative in film, television, and in books. And today, spoiler chat, Dust of Dreams, Part 2, The Electric Boogaloo. I am joined once. That is a very rude symbol in the UK.
Sorry, part two. Sorry, I'm American. Sorry, nothing meant by that. Sorry, AP.
I'm gonna have to try and work out what the filter is to blur that out. I am joined by the very rude Dr. Philip Chase.
Wait, it was two? How do you do two over there? How do you make it two?
Two.
Oh, sorry, everyone.
Well, if we were German, two.
Okay.
1, 2.
Yeah, that makes sense too, I suppose. But anyway, well, that was an auspicious start.
Sidetracked already. So, oh God. Right. So we had left off last time because there's so much to talk about in this. And I think one of the things that we were talking about in the non-spoiler discussion on your channel, the themes of leadership, and I'd kind of linked that to this. It's a very dark book because it's about the fractures and flaws in a society that we overlook until suddenly they appear, and we are blindsided by it. We go, where did that come from? And yet the signs were always there. And so obviously one of the ones I want to talk about is Tull and his leadership of the Barghast, but also then what transpires with him becoming the first sword again and becoming the leader of the Immas, and what that means. Because I think both the white-faced Barghast and the Immas in this book are recontextualized for readers. And it might seem surprising. A lot of us might think, I liked them before now. Where did this come from?
Yeah.
And the frightening thing is, it has been present in both of their cultures, this shocking violence, the darkness of it, and the problems inherent in their societies have been there the entire time. But because we like Tull, because we liked Hetan, because we like certain of these characters, Trots in the first few books, because we liked them so much, we were willing to overlook a lot of the different aspects of it. And we just didn't see it until this is the book where we are confronted with that reality.
Yeah, absolutely. It's such a thing that it can be difficult for us to see because we have our built-in biases and prejudices, and we spend time identifying with the people from these cultures. And so, as you say, it can come as a shock when suddenly they commit acts that seem horrible to us. But these are not coming from nowhere. There are precedents for these things all over the place throughout the series. And so, and Tull, I think, is a great example of a leader's put in a situation because of the particular cultural values that are surrounding him, a situation where he really can't win. And he knows what he's going into, in a sense, and makes an incredible sacrifice as a leader. But he was put in that corner because of the particular cultural values that he was dealing with the people he was leading. Similar to it, I think later we can talk about the Sheikh in a very similar manner in terms of cultural values and how they put a leader of these people into a certain corner, and how that can make of a leader someone who actually has very few choices. So a very fascinating and obviously deliberate thread in the midst of this, in the series as a whole, but it really comes to the fore here in Dust of Dreams.
So I think let's start unpack, because there's quite a lot here. So let's try and break it apart, and let's talk about that concept you just were mentioning there. The idea of a leader not only having power, but being restricted in choice. And
Right.
this is something that has come up a number of times and quite often leads to quite animated fan discussion.
Mm-hmm.
Lassine's enactment of the purging of nobles in Unta that leads to what happens to Felasin. Lassine is criticized for that, and yet that was Kellanved's plan.
Right.
Lassine is responsible for the purging of the wax witches, the burning of the mouse. But again, that was under the auspices and sort of guise of Kellanved. That
At the time.
this was a
Yeah.
way of controlling mages to make sure that they were only in the military and the military had control. Therefore, the empire had control of them. The killing of the nobles, again, it was a way of exacting control. And then obviously we have it with Hellion doing the same thing on her
Mhm.
march through. And she does it. And we celebrate that because of the narrative perspective. But when we get to the Bone Hunters, and that it is the Bone Hunters, the conflict on, or is it Midnight Tides? Bone Hunters.
Which conflict?
Malaz City, where Lassine is.
It's at the end of Bone Hunters. Yeah.
Yeah. And Lassine is caught in, yes, she's the Empress. Yes, she has all of this power. But Malik Rel has orchestrated certain things, which has limited her options. So she
Right.
needs an out, and she needs Kalam. But also she needs the military support, which means that she needs Tavor. Otherwise, she's left with the other aspect of the military. And you can see that her options are narrowed down. And we sometimes think, but why didn't she just? And when you think of it in terms of if you're in that position with the level of knowledge that you have, sometimes your options are very limited because you've boxed yourself into a corner, and you've made decisions all the way along that you thought were the right decisions. But ultimately you get to a point where you go, I've boxed myself into this dead end. How do I get out? And when we think of Tul, and sorry, the reason that was a whole digression there, sorry. But when we think of Tul as an Imas, when we first met him, had been divorced from the rest of the Talan Imas. He was like an Imas on his own.
Yep.
And that made him unique. It gave him a sense of individuality that a lot of the other Imas did not have. Also, as First Sword, he is a person within the Talan Imas. It wasn't just a title of, he was really good with the sword. It gave him an individuality. Then he became mortal again. And remember what we saw when the Imas become mortal in the Refugium. They are overwhelmed by the sense of life, things that they had lost, things that suddenly the sensation of touching things, it is so beautiful, it's so powerful. That is what Tul is now confronted with. After almost millennia of being a cold, emotionless killer, being enlivened and feeling those emotions, what becomes the thing that you want to protect the most? Life. And yet he finds himself married to Hetan. And because of a quirk of fate, her father has died. She has been elected sort of leader, and therefore he is now the war leader of the Bargas tribe.
Senon, yeah.
And they are warlike. And that is the last thing that he wants. He saw what the drive of war did to the Imas. They sacrificed their mortality, they sacrificed their souls to become killers. He knows what an eternity like that is actually like. He's lived it. And so he's looking at this going, I appreciate that, I'm now in charge of a warrior culture. There is a better way. And like so many people who do not have the lived experience of something, they go, oh no, but I'd be a better leader. And we can see those challenges to his leadership. And he, like, what is he meant to do? He keeps sort of saying to them, like, you need to trust me. I've been down that road.
Yeah.
And so we see his plan, taking his most vocal critics out together to show them why this is not a fight that they want. This is not a fight that they can win. This is not what they want to do. And he's trying to show them the physical proof, because they won't believe him. They won't listen to the logic. They won't listen to his experience.
And of course, one reason for that is he's an outsider. You know, he is an outsider. And so that is it's one of the first things that becomes attacked when people of a certain culture feel that their culture is in danger, is the outsiders. We blame the outsiders. So that is one, I think, sticking point for the Barghast, like Bacall and Strahl and the leaders of various groups within the Senon. They resent Tool as an outsider. That's a key part of this. And it's often the people who are perceived as outsiders, as others, who get blamed under these circumstances where people from a certain culture feel threatened. And it's really interesting, too, because the life that Tool establishes with Hetan is so, I think, emblematic of what you were talking about, with what the other Immas were experiencing in the refugium. The idea of just appreciating the beauty of being alive and being in relationships with other people and perceiving that. And that is a beautiful relationship between the two. It's poignant and powerful, and they have a child together, and he's like a father. He is a father to her children, her twins by Krupp. So it's a beautiful thing that he finds. And yet you see him being pushed further and further into this tiny corner where finally he has no choice, if he's going to act like a leader, but to kill himself in order to sacrifice himself for the good of the Senon. And in that moment, completely shifting the perspective of these insiders like Bacall and Strahl and the others, who suddenly realize, oh my God, we were so wrong. It's really quite amazingly set up.
And that, I think, is a very powerful point, because obviously Krupp and Hetan's children, he goes, yeah, they're my daughters. I love them. Then his child with Hetan, yes, that's my son. But when he's faced with all of these calls from the warriors to be a war leader, to lead them in battle, and everyone's looking at him, but you could beat all of them in a fight. You could just kill them. And he goes, yeah, I could. And if we think back to Memories of Ice, when Trotz was putting his petition to the white-faced Barghast, remember the combat to the death that they enacted, the night of blood that preceded the formal combats and duels, where they worked out all of their grievances by killing each other. And we sometimes overlook that the Barghast are incredibly violent.
Yeah.
And they have these ritualized murders, and they even like running around at night and enacting murder to enact vengeance. And we see that when Tool is taken over, with that change of leadership, we find out he stopped them doing that, and they resented it. But this was my opportunity to kill my rival. This was my opportunity to knife that person to get revenge. So we can see the resentment. How dare you change our tradition? How dare you prevent me from killing someone who annoyed me? And then outsider. And then we see Sakara's reasoning.
Yeah.
He's jealous of Hetan's position. She wants to be the leader. She wants to have all the material possessions. She doesn't want to lead her people into a better place. She doesn't want to lead to improve the lives of her people. She wants power for herself.
Right.
And we can see that Tool and Hetan are not trying to establish power to make their lives better. They're trying to lead the people for a better life. And because of that, Tool does not want to kill them, but obviously he can. And so he chose that option of, bring me the most vocal critics. We will go out into the wild. I will show you this thing. I will explain this thing to you. And even then, he is challenged. And it is better to demonstrate this once than to kill all of you. Because if I start fighting now, I'll kill you. And then the next person is going to go, well, I challenge you. I will have to kill all of you. He lays it all out for them. Yeah. And still, they do not back down until he, without effort, almost without moving, it is so fast.
Yeah.
They don't sit. And he wins. And he goes, this is what I am trying to avoid. I am not a coward. I am not afraid. But what good is it to kill all of you? And it's at that moment that they have their eyes open to it. Yep. And unfortunately, it's too late.
Yep. Because
the other Barghast are coming and they're about to raid. And the only way in that moment where Tull looks around, he is finally convinced his most vocal critics of this new way, this new approach, they can go out now into the tribes and start enacting real change. But they can't do it if they're all dead.
Right.
So he sees in those seconds, he knows, because he can feel the vibrations of the Barghast running in. It's not like they are very far away. They are really close. He has seconds. The only way to avoid killing everyone, which he could do, and that would ultimately weaken the Barghast, is to sacrifice himself. For the future of the tribe, for the future of the people. And so he makes that sacrifice. And as he is dying, he hopes that they will have enough power to protect his wife and children.
Yeah, I think he's aware on some level that he has not just doomed himself in that moment, but perhaps he's doomed Hetan and their children, which is where this ultimately ends up, and it adds a whole. It's already a vast tragedy here, but it adds a whole lot more tragedy to this situation. And again, I think under Marl Ebb, who is the leader, who is aggressively trying to assert the old values and go back to being true Barghasts and, take back the Barghasts, So I think it's fair to say that Hetan is also a victim of that mentality, that idea that of just going back and then reasserting the old values because this is the way it's been, and and even horrific customs like hobbling. There's a failure to recognize what that is because you're there in this space. Some of them do, though, so maybe that's not an excuse. Some of them do recognize that this thing that is happening now is wrong. This is horrible. It goes back to the stories like Shirley Jackson's The Lottery. You have certain townsfolk who recognize this tradition we have is really messed up, but they're not the most powerful ones in the town. And so do they have the authority to overturn this tradition? They can maybe surreptitiously question it and suggest, hey, maybe we should take a look at this. But you speak up too much and you're going to be this year's sacrifice, right? And that's the way these things work. There's a real powerful tendency to conform to the group. And
out of fear.
Out of fear, because you don't want to be the one who's the next victim or the next one to be hobbled,
And when we think back to when we met Hetan in Memories of Ice, like Hetan was very, very aggressive, quite violent. Her brothers, quite violent. They are an incredibly violent culture. But because we liked Trots, because we actually liked Hetan, we kind of overlooked it. And before we started, I mentioned to you, there's a great line that Spax has when he is talking to the Queen of Brastel.
Yeah, it's a very telling line, perhaps not great.
Well, it's a line that I think we overlook in the same way that we overlook so much, because nothing seems to come of it until obviously what happens to Hetan later on. But Abrastel actually says to him, I imagine the one you call Tull might piss in laughter at hearing that. The Gilk's broad, flat face lost all traces of humor. If you were not a queen, woman, I'd have you hobbled for that. And
Yeah.
one of the things, and Erikson has spoken about this in the past, hobbling obviously there's a lot of archaeological evidence for it in cultures across the world.
Mm-hmm.
And most of us are far more familiar with the term hobble in terms of like the sort of the shoes and covers and straps that you put on a horse's feet to stop them wandering off. You talk about hobbling the horse.
Right.
But hobbling as a punishment has been there throughout human history. Multiple
we've
cultures.
come up with all kinds of hideous things, haven't we? Yeah.
And it's not exactly unheard of in the 20th century either.
Wow.
The beating of people's feet. If you think of the treatment of prisoners of war in certain places during the 20th century, they had their ankles broken, they had their feet broken, they had the soles of their feet beaten.
Right.
And people were threatened with this as late as any time period in the 20th century.
Yeah.
This is not ancient practice. This is a continuing human inhumane treatment and violence that we perpetrate. And
yeah.
It's one that we are quite often blind to and we ignore, and we don't think about.
Right.
This violence has been there with the Bargas from the start. This was the very thing that Tull was standing up against, because it is self-destructive. It is the curse and bane of the Bargas. And how do you change that? And ultimately, we see it is a self-fulfilling prophecy. They do end up, they end up being destroyed, not necessarily because of this thing, but because of those actions. When Tull comes back, gone is the Tull who had a sense of humor. Gone is the Tull who had feelings and emotions. What is returned is the first sword of the Imas.
Yeah.
And this suddenly makes very, very real who the Imas were. Because again, like the Bargas, we had a very comfortable notion about the Imas because Tull we liked. Who's the one who was with the Eater?
Oh, that was with Troll and Onrak.
Tull and Onrak we spent a lot of time with, and we quite enjoyed their company, and they seemed nice enough. And then we forgot that in the prologue of Memories of Ice, one of the wars on the Jagat was chasing down a woman and her 2 children.
Yeah.
And we forget that the Imas as a race became undying in order to commit genocide, that they hunted down as many Jagat as they could, that it was the fear that a potential tyrant might arise. Not we're going to band together to defeat this tyrant, because they did that with the Jagat and then afterwards turned on them.
Yeah.
The Imas are genocidal. The capacity for single-minded violence is inherent in their story. And we have been told this, we have been shown this, but we as readers do not believe it until this moment, when we see it, and when we see it perpetrated against characters whose perspectives we've had. And that, again, understanding it from the receiving end.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, think of the imagery of this with Tull being reanimated by Olar Ethel against his will, and to become the first sword again of the Amas, and how he seamed with scars, and because he was essentially chopped up into bits by the Bargas when they couldn't take his life, they took out their frustrations. And it seems like a lot of this is really an assertion of power. It is an assertion of power when you hobble someone. You're making them powerless, and therefore yourself in relation to them more powerful. And the sexual violence is often, I think, a similar thing. And it's no accident that what happens to Hetan is paired with sexual violence. That is part of the hobbling, I guess, in this particular culture. The whole thing is taking power away from someone. And and it's a sick way of trying to empower oneself. So it is, a lot of it is about power, or a misunderstanding, I think, in some ways of power and how it works.
Well, it is about power. It is a brutal enforcement of power, and it's a way of enforcing your will to put someone else down. And that is one of the uses of power. Like,
Yeah.
power in and of itself, it's just the ability to do something, really.
Yeah.
And in this instance, it's I'm going to push you down because then I am elevated, as opposed to I could use this power to elevate all of us, which is what Tool was trying to do. But
right.
in trying to change things about the past, and we see this even in the Volcando, the Queen of Brastel is clearly a very competent, good ruler to a certain extent.
Very clever, very clever. Yeah.
And yet we have the two courtiers who are scheming, and you go, oh well, they're obviously evil, but the Queen knows that. We have that whole discussion that the princess has with undead pirate woman.
Oh, Shirk Alal. Yeah.
Where Shirk points out, but you have these systems of power in place that keep you in power.
Right.
You know it's unequal. You know that you benefit from it, and you keep other people in their place. And because of that, you're comfortable keeping that going. And it's a complete circle. If you try to change that dynamic, if you try to make people equal, the people at the top will resist it because they will see themselves losing prestige. The people at the bottom might resist it because they go, but if I get to the top, then I can keep other people down and I'll be the important one. Then there's this war of how we perceive the world around us and the best way to go about something, and whether our own personal elevation is worth the suffering of others. Yeah. Talked about this about Omelas and Le Guin's story.
Yeah. There's an element of futility to all of this too, and this assertion of power over others in through violence and sexual violence and aggression. It all comes to what in the end when Draconis shows up, right? When there's this battle going on between the Barghast under Marl Ebb and the Akrinai, who are being attacked by the Barghast with the flimsiest of excuses. And you see this all the time with aggressive cultures who feel that they're somehow under threat. It's interesting how the most aggressive and threatening cultures often project themselves as the ones being under threat. And that's what the Barghast are doing in here. But it all comes to what when Draconis shows up and everybody gets in the most, powerful way frozen. It's really quite something. The futility of this, it's in a way reminds me a bit of the Reaper's Gale battle, where all these people are just slogging it out in the mud, and everything is just such a message of futility. All of this aggression and posturing and trying to say, put yourself above others, and it comes to what in the end? We end up dust, all of us, don't we?
And for a series that's known as being military fantasy, so much of what Erikson explores is the futility of war.
Right.
But even then, if we think of Tehol and Tehol's plan to change Lethari society, and he's going to enact all of these plans, but people are already objecting because he wants to stop the deforestation.
Yeah.
Because if you do it manageably, you have a continual resource that you can use for generations. But if you just chop everything down, short term, you make a load of money, but then all of the trees are gone and desertification sets in, and then people die because you can't use it for anything. And it's the short term versus long term. But we already see, even though Tehol is looking at this and going, well, what do you want me to do? I can't enact all of these plans at once because they would just depose me. Even though you look at it and you go, logically, yes, that is the better way to manage the resource so that it is renewable, it keeps going.
And there you have another leader who's put in a corner because of the cultural values that surround him. And he knows what needs to be done, but he also knows he can't enact everything he wants to do because of the resistance it would inevitably create. So even though he and Jonathan, have these ideas about how to save society, it's almost like, it's really incredible how this is portrayed here as well.
Society doesn't want to be saved.
No, because we're so good at short-term thinking.
But also because we don't realize that we need saving. That's the problem.
True.
We're sitting there going, but we don't need saving. Everything's fine as the world burns around us.
Yeah.
Because we have quite a limited perspective. And weirdly enough, I think part of this actually ties in some respects, to the title of the novel, The Dust of Dreams, the dream that you have of the future. Yeah. In all of these a lot of the different instances in the book, that dream is turning to dust in their very hands because they cannot get to the future. They cannot enact the future, that it is forever beyond their grasp.
Yeah. Oh my goodness. The title, there are so many ways in which this title resonates, both in terms of dust and in terms of dreams, and then sometimes with both of them together. So with dust, obviously the Imas is it's a big, I think, nod to the Imas and where they're headed here in this. And there's a lot of futility mixed in with that. And you mentioned the whole history that Toole is so aware of the Imas and the genocide that they were enacting and all of that. And again, the futility of it. But you also have characters, we talked about Icarium before, and in terms of dreams and all of that, and the ephemeralness of all of this, the ephemeralness of dreams is so very much linked to the notion of us as dust, essentially, ashes to ashes, dust to dust, and that's what we return to. So yeah, the idea of dreaming comes up so many times in here, and in so many contexts. This is also the book that has the poem, right, by Fisher about dreaming, and we analyzed that poem some time ago in the context of it being an interesting, actually, look at how we grieve and how we dream, and I think that it's one of the more, actually, we talk about this book as being grimmer than most of the other entries in the series, but that poem is actually, I find it strangely consoling and hopeful in a way. But yeah.
And that, I think, that's the counterpoint to this, that while the dust of these dreams, it's a sort of the death of the dreams, the death of the future, the death of a positive way forward. And we see it with the Barghast, we see it with the Imas in this book. Yeah, we see it even like with the Jagat, that they're basically a couple of Jagat left, and they find that all of their futures have been robbed in some respects, but at the same time, the striving for a new future we see with the Kachin Chamal, when Badal Rut says, we still live. Where there is life, there is hope. In the Snake, we still live. Children may be dying, but we still live. That insistence on life, that insistence on existence. And that thread provided by the Snake all the way through. They don't just accept the inevitable, fight through. And they find Icarius, they find the city, they find a refuge, they find a potential future for themselves. Now, that doesn't mean that their journey was easy. Their journey is brutal. Change and surviving to the future can be brutal and hard. It's not easy. But what are our choices? Do we sacrifice the future and just lay down and die? Or do we fight for it? And fighting for it is not necessarily sticking a sword in someone else. Exactly. Yeah. Do not go gentle into that good night, in the immortal words of Dylan Thomas. Yeah. Yeah. No, it's brilliant stuff. Was there anything else then about the Barghast that we should insert here, or do we want to move on to the Sheikh? Because pretty much everything we've been talking about is transferable, I think, in some with slightly different facets to it when it comes to the Sheikh. Well, we can kind of transition to the Sheikh, because I think, again, it's about a movement of the people to a dream that they had of their future, and then when they get there, it's not quite what they thought it was.
Right. Arcanus is a desolate place, not what they had thought about in their mythology. Yeah.
Yeah, it could do with a lick of paint, I suppose, would be one way of describing it.
Yeah.
But again, their journey, as a people, like they've left their islands, the seas have been rising, they're being pushed and hemmed, and and the sacrifice that Twilight makes with her blood to open this path, the path of Galan, blind Galan, who had told them all about it, through Curl Galen, and you're like, oh, that's a nice
coincidence.
But when they get that, so that is a sacrifice. They arrive as refugees, like, again, refugees, like we had with the chain of dogs, like we had with the snake. The Sheikh are refugees as well, and in order to get there, Yedin Derrig, who is
the Watch,
a fascinating character.
Oh yeah. Well, you talk about sacrifice. Okay, so obviously Twilight, his sister Jan Tovis, is the leader of this group, the queen of the Sheikh. But he does it. He commits a horrible act. Pretty. You know, he massacres all of the witches and warlocks, or whatever they're called.
Almost all.
Yeah, almost all. 2, Pulley and Squish, are with good timing elsewhere when it happens. But other than that, it's a massacre. Why does he do it? And this again goes back to, we're talking about the cultural values of the Barghast before. The Sheikh also have these cultural values that are causing them to see the world in a certain way that is destructive, that is negative. And he sees a kind of, from his point of view, this is a necessity. We have to get rid of these people for the survival of the group.
Because they are undermining her. They're undermining the leadership, and he's there to protect them. And so, how do I protect? I'm going to kill all of the opposition. You know, as angry or as disappointed as we can be in politicians, I don't think anyone is suggesting that is the way that we deal with things.
Oh, I don't know. Some people might like to do that, but
no,
they're not in charge. Yeah.
That is not the way that we deal with problems. We deal with problems through education. We deal with problems through understanding the positions and trying to find a way forward together. But he is a black and white. They are a problem. I've eliminated the problem.
Very much so.
And Twilight looks at this and goes, what did you do?
Yeah. I mean, she's horrified. His middle name is not Subtle, Yedin Subtle Derrig. No, sorry.
And it's interesting. He is very self-contained. You see a lot about his tension is always held in his jaw. He's always grinding his teeth, clenching his jaw. That it's he has a very self-contained, almost repressed level of violence that then is unleashed. And then we get that moment where this is what they sacrifice things for. This is what he worked for. They get to Carcanis and it is a disappointment, except Mother Dark can be heard. Mother Dark is there.
Yeah.
And suddenly there is the promise of a future, but they also discover Lightfall, the shore between darkness and light.
And suddenly their mythology takes on a whole new resonance, right?
And so what's so wonderful about this, not only is it tying into these themes that we've been talking about in this book, but it ties into this whole notion that we've explored in previous books of what you know of the past, the story you've been told of the past has been twisted and altered over time. And it might be symbolically true, but what you took as a literal truth is not quite. It's changed. It's not really that thing. And even then, it may have been based on partial information or a misinterpretation of something.
Right.
And we've seen that over time, things have changed and they've reinterpreted and reinterpreted. And
Right.
this is a commonality through so many of these books where someone says, oh, and they tell a story of the ancient past. And even when they were there, their memory of it is flawed, that they sort of remember it. And they go, well, this is exactly what happened. And I bet if you ask someone else who was there at the same time, they go, that's not what happened.
For example, look at Mother Dark. The narrative is that she turned her back on her children. I get the sense that this Mother Dark, and also this is coming from To All the Hounds as well, I get the sense that Mother Dark has had some frustrations with her children. The story is much more complex than just her turning her back. And that you get that in To All the Hounds, I think that's fair to say, particularly at the end of it. But also here with hearing her voice here in Desolate Carcanos. So that I feel like before she may have turned her back, people weren't listening to her very well. So.
And this ties into what we were talking about leadership. What sort of leader? What do you do with the power? Should Mother Dark have been a tyrant and enforced her will upon people with her power? Should she have done that? To go, I will drag you kicking and screaming. The way that we argue Tull should have enforced his will on the Barghast. He should have used violence to enforce his will on the Barghast as a tyrant, the thing that he spent millennia trying to destroy. He should become a tyrant or lead by example. Oh, well, leading by example is good. Well, except, well, that's what Tull was doing and that didn't work out.
Not so well for him or his loved ones. Yeah.
And we get into this argument where if someone leads by example, but it doesn't work out, we go, they should have enforced their power. If someone enforces their power and we don't like it, you go, they're being a tyrant. It all depends on whether or not we agree with them.
Yep.
Which I think is fascinating because you see it with Mother Dark. We see it with Tull. We see it with the different elements within the Barghast. We see it with the Queen of the Belcando.
Oh, the Queen. Oh, yes, of the Belcando, yeah.
And again, we see it with the different levels of hierarchy within the Malazan army.
Mm-hmm.
Lead by example. Take people into your trust. Don't tell them everything. Trust them with your plans, but don't trust them with all of your plans. Hold information back, but give them the information.
This is Tavor. I mean, look at poor Tavor. She is dealing with all of these things, right? That is her dilemma.
But look at the difference between Fiddler and Hedge. Fiddler is trying to build up the Bone Hunters, trying to give the various squads, the other soldiers, encouragement, support, so that they can learn to do things themselves. What does Hedge do?
He wants to go back to the bridge burners. He wants to live in the past. Ghost Hedge.
Sets up the bridge burners again.
Yeah.
And the bridge burners are gone. You can't live in the past.
Yeah.
But he doesn't listen. And he refuses to hear it. And he can't understand why Fiddler doesn't want to spend time with him. And Fiddler's going, I mourned you.
Yeah.
And then I moved on. And now you just want to go back to the way it was. We can't go back. We can never go back. And we see that literalized in what the Sheikh did. You can't ever just go back and, oh, look, it's a Disney palace waiting for us.
No, indeed. Yeah.
So I think that concept of leadership, the flaws of leaders, the use of power, how the power structures work. When people read this book, I think if you're paying attention to that, and sometimes this involves kind of taking a step away from the immediacy of what's on the page and actually thinking about the dynamics behind it, it becomes this richness underlying the text. And it's what a lot of what we talk about in terms of subtext and investigation. But one thing that we need to talk about is the battle at the end.
Yes, the battle where the Naruk roll over the Malazans.
Because you know what? As much as we love talking about theme, as much as we love talking about these esoteric and abstract concepts, sometimes You want the red meat of.
Well, I'm a vegetarian, AP. I'm a vegetarian.
You want the red lettuce of a good fight.
Thank you for changing the metaphor.
Because this is a battle that we have seen the Malazans steamroll almost everyone, with the exception maybe at Peel. They did win, but I wouldn't call it a steamroll victory. But
no.
The Malazans have essentially just every time they go, they wipe out the opposition. And here we have the Malazans walking along, and Clowns to the left of them, Naruk to the right, and they're stuck in the middle of this clash, and it's not going to be good.
No.
And we see, even with all of their talents, their training, the munitions, they are outclassed here.
Totally. And it's interesting though, because it does bring out a few mysterious elements that are hiding within the Malazan ranks, such as Ruthin Good, who's gotten a hold, whoever he is, has gotten a hold of some very special armor and weaponry from, I guess, Corelry, right? I mean,
well,
from
and he mentions
Wall.
Greymane a lot. So, you know, that ties in, obviously, when we were talking about Stonewielder by Ian C. Esselman. There's a lot of that explored there. So if you've read Stonewielder, what Ruthin Good does, you sort of, I recognize those things.
Right. Yeah.
And this, we've heard that expression throughout of the shaved knuckle in the hole, where Quick Ben and Kalam and the various squad mages would all, you know, they kept their heads down. They didn't want to be noticed. But when push comes to shove, these figures come forward. We saw it with Beak.
Yeah.
And in this moment, facing off against the Naruk, they're vastly outnumbered. The Naruk are more physically powerful. They're not in a good defensive position. They have small trenches with little berms that they've managed to dig very quickly, which, you know, is what sappers do.
Yeah.
But they have limited munitions, and still they have a very good showing. They maul the enemy, but when the enemy has that many numbers, and as we've discussed, the Kachin don't think of numbers the way that we do.
Right. Yeah, they're the hive or whatever. Yeah. I'll tell you, the moment in that battle that really got me, and I had to stop reading for a bit, was the heavies. When the heavies stand their ground, and it's a sacrifice because they're giving the rest of the tattered Malazan troops a chance to get away, you know, who've already been mauled. But the heavies who just stand there, you know, in lockstep against, like you said, they are vastly superior, physically much bigger foes, but they just stand their ground. They do that, and they're doing it for their brothers and sisters. You know, they're doing it as an act of sacrifice. We talked about sacrifice a lot here. It's another example, very poignant, I would say. And the whole battle is just, it's really, I mean, it's really something. Of course, these other elements show up and things escalate, you know. I mean, talk about a convergence, really. And it's a good example of one.
And that the heavies, who, let's face it, we've made fun of all the way through. Like, they're big and they're dumb, and it's their job to stand with a big shield and just stand in lockstep with their shields to block. Oh, anyone can do that. And in this moment, we realize their worth, and we know that a lot of them are not going to survive, and we feel that loss. And they aren't the same characters like Quick Ben and Ruthin Good, who have amazing power. They are us. They don't have munitions to throw to blow up lots of the enemy.
Right.
And they make that sacrifice. They stand the ground, and their will. And we've talked, you know, it's one of those things about Malazan, cold iron, hot iron. They stand there and they go, we will not give up.
Right.
The power of their will, the power of relying on each other, the power of a modern military working together versus a mob coming at them. We understand that, but we understand it's going to cost them. And then with with the explosions basically of what Ruth and Good does, which big spectacle. The explosion, Quick Bet, unleashing all of this power, and again, massive spectacle. And as if you couldn't go, well, how can that ever be topped? Icarium showing up and blowing Skykeeps out of the sky.
Oh my goodness. Yeah, that's just beyond my imagination. I mean, it was just, whoa. Yeah.
The scale of this just, it ramps up, and yet it always comes back down to the fact, yes, while this is spectacle, it's the individuals on the ground. Because
and Sin and Grub too, my God. I mean, holy cow. The explosions, lasers and fireballs, big time, right?
Well, lightning bolts and fireballs. I next time I'm speaking to Iskar, I must have to raise that point. It's lightning bolts, not lasers.
Well, I think we're stuck with lasers now. I'm sorry.
But the spectacle of all of this, but we suddenly see how all of those different elements of the Malazan army, the characters, the people involved, we see how they come together. We get glimpses of them in battle, and it feels like that we're there with them. And just the sheer scale of it, we understand how outmatched they are. In all of this before, we knew the gods are playing this game and they're meddling with the lives of mortals. But when we've met the gods, the ones that we've kind of gotten to know, Shadowthrone's a bit crazy, Cotillion seems like a decent guy, Bug Meal he's actually quite nice, and he's serving as the sort of the chancellor. You know, they're great. It's now that we suddenly realize, no, the scale and the power involved here is radically different.
Right.
Humans are just a small piece on the board. And it's that almost like the board dropping away from our feet, and we look down and go, this is a lot bigger than we thought it was. We were down there in the muck and we could see the people around us. And now we're getting a bird's eye view of it and go, this is so much bigger.
Yep.
On a scale that we hadn't considered.
And the crazy thing is, this is kind of a side quest, right? They're still on their way, what's left of them, to do something even bigger, which is going to be in the Crippled God, of course. So, and completely involving those powerful elements that you were talking about, the gods and everything else getting wrapped up into this. So this was just sort of on the way. This was a diversion on the way to where the real thing is going to be happening. And my goodness, what a place to leave us off, huh?
And once we then realized that, you know, as we had mentioned, the Jagat are now involved, the Imas are involved, the Kachin Chamal are involved. And we have seen the Forcalasil being involved. And what do we know about convergence in the Malazan world? Power draws power. That we know that these forces are slowly being drawn to one another. And it reminds me somewhat of one of the myths behind the Iliad, that the Olympian gods had decided there were too many demigods. So we'll just have a war to thin out the numbers.
Yeah.
That's part of the inevitability, I think, that we're seeing here is so many of these events were set in motion hundreds of thousands of years ago. But it has taken until now, considering the vast powers involved, for them to come rushing into a focus. And once you get to that point, once you've passed the tipping point, it is inevitable. Yeah. But people spent all of those time trying to avoid the convergence. This is why they were trying to avoid it. Why all of these powers were so wary about getting involved. And we've seen over the course of this, powers getting involved that maybe they shouldn't have. And the ramification of that is this building towards this point.
Yep.
That underlying tension has just been there, and we've seen it explored. It's been told to us, it's been shown to us, and now we're experiencing it.
Yep, indeed.
But are there any other aspects of this that you would like to chat about, my friend?
My goodness, inevitably we've missed something.
We always miss things.
We didn't talk a lot about Breeze Bedict, I guess, but we covered in the earlier chat. I think we talked about him and Anaricht a little bit.
I think Breeze is a. We can talk very briefly about this because I have one point about Breeze that I think is
okay.
is
It'll
nice.
be a breeze, no problem. Yeah.
With Hood taking his throne and there suddenly being a change in how death is perceived, we see that Breeze becomes enlivened. And again, that aspect of the refugium, learning new life, that he had been brought back to life, but he wasn't all the way there, that something wasn't quite right. And we get a sense that maybe that's a problem with Hedge as well. But Breeze suddenly coming alive again and looking around him at, oh, a quickening of his heart, shall we call it?
Yeah.
But an appreciation for life. And yet this is a man trained to be an expert duelist, an expert swordsman, an expert warrior. His whole purpose is killing. And he's leading an army, ostensibly as an escort, as a guard. But the feeling of suddenly being alive and appreciating life, that I will kill to protect life, that contradiction. And I am sure members of the armed forces around the world struggle with this. Life is something worth protecting. That's, why they join up. But in order to protect it, they have to take life. And those contradictions are not a flaw in the narrative. I think those are the contradictions that we all possess and are being explored.
Absolutely. Yeah, I agree with that very much. And I expect to see more of that in The Crippled God. So, yeah. Well,
and on that note then, Philip, thank you so much for joining me.
Pleasure, my friend. Yeah, absolute pleasure. It's always fun to talk to you about any old story, but Malazan is, wow, something very special about this series. It's just so somehow encapsulates all of life in a way that I find so powerful and so moving. So I appreciate this very much, actually. And looking forward to, we're near the end now. We've got The Crippled God and a sail. And wow, it just feels like something very special to me. So thank you.
You are very welcome, and thank you as well. But just to say to people who are wondering, we're back on course now. So hopefully when Philip can fit the crippled, because I've disrupted Philip's schedule. When Philip can fit The Crippled God in, we'll read it and we'll move on with those talks. So thank you very much for watching. Thank you for your continued support, and we will see you in the next one.